And welcome back to the channel, guys. And today I'm going to talk to you about how you can actually use property as a wealth creation tool and things to kind of look for when actually getting into your first property and another investment property. Now just remember, guys, that I'm not a professional financial advisor, and you should seek personal financial advice from a professional. Anything I do say in these videos is just tools and things that I've done in the past, which has helped me in my journey to wealth creation, especially with property and things like that. So we'll get started. So today, like I said, we're going to chat to you about what to kind of look for and things to kind of do when looking for a investment property or even just your first initial property. Property is actually a fantastic tool to actually generate and increase your wealth. I do know a few books out there and a few investors and things who aren't the biggest fan of property for certain reasons, but I do still find it's actually a fantastic method to actually get wealthy. At the end of the day, everyone always needs a place to live, everyone needs a roof over their head, so it's actually something which, if you're on the right side of it, it is a good way to actually generate and create wealth for yourself and for generations to come follow afterwards. So, one thing I actually like about property as an investment tool or device is that it's actually a physical asset. You can actually look at it, see it, touch it. If you need to check on it, you can actually drive past it, depending on where it is, and see the state of it. Like I said, a lot of people give it a bit of a bad rap, as in it's not the greatest for generating returns over the long term, this and that. But that's another factor to kind of consider in how you're going to hold on to it and what you actually want to do with the property over time. So, like I said, the reason why I like it is I can actually do something to it to increase its value and sell it off or rent it out for an income. So you can generate wealth from property in a couple of ways. As I said in the previous video, in 7 steps to creating wealth for yourself. You can actually develop or generate a rental income from it. So you get tenants living in there, they pay a weekly or monthly rent or however you set it up, and that will should cover the cost of that property if you're holding it, and also give you some kind of income over time. Another thing you can actually do with the property is, as over time it does increase in value, and you can sell it off for that profit or kind of refinance that property with the bank and actually get that equity out to use for other purchases and things like that. Those are some other wealth creation strategies out there. So we'll get into the steps of what you should be looking for when actually starting to look at properties. So the first step is similar with the steps to create wealth creation. You want to know where your finances are. You actually want to find out how much you actually borrow or what you have available to you to actually borrow. There's no point in driving around a city or a suburb looking at properties which you can't even afford, because one, it's a waste of time, two, you're not going to get it. So you may as well be putting your time and energy into something that you can actually get and work on to, like I said, bring you more wealth. So like I said, first step, sit down with a mortgage broker and find out with them what you can actually borrow to buy, or where you can actually have some wiggle room. And they'll give you an indication of what you need to do, or if you're lacking in certain areas. So sometimes it might just be a deposit to actually buy the property. I know banks here in Australia typically want 20% for a deposit for the property. I think they're easing that rule now, so you can go as low as 5 in some cases, but there was a stage where you had to have at least a 20% deposit. My nurse at work, she actually had her financial broker tell her, you need to save a bit more before you can actually go and purchase anything. So something, like I said, something that you should do in the initial stages, sit down with a mortgage broker and figure out how much you can borrow. If you aren't allowed to borrow enough, that means you've got to either cut back on expenses and luxuries and things like that, or increase your income so that you can actually have more money to borrow for yourself. The next thing to remember when it comes to property is the golden rule, and that is location, location, location. So no matter where you're looking at property, you always want to make sure it's at a decent location, because that will play a major role in where the property prices of your investment will go over the time. and if you'll be making a significant amount of money or not. Now, a bit of a rule of thumb, you always want to try and be as close to the CBD as possible, but in saying that, the closer you get to the city, sometimes the more expensive it is. So depending on what your budget and limiting factors are, you might not necessarily be able to get as close to the city as you want. So you want to be looking within a kind of a 10-kilometer radius of the CBD kind of thing. Those are usually the nice areas. Some other things to consider when looking at some suburbs and locations is what kind of amenities do they have in that suburb? Like, is there good schooling? Is there easy access to transportation? Is it easy to kind of get into a thoroughfare to go to like work and things like that? Is there jobs in the area? You also want to be close enough to certain like thoroughfares and highways and things, but not actually on the highway, because you don't want that noise pollution coming in afterwards. As well as that, another thing to consider is the area undergoing some gentrification? Like, is the average age of that property kind of increasing as those tenants or people live in those properties get older? They will start looking at selling, and so generally an older suburb, that means that more properties are coming onto the market. It can also drive down prices and things like that. So there's a few factors to play in that scenario there. So just something to consider that in that scenario. Also as well, you want to consider or check with the police in the area if there's a lot of crime, because you don't necessarily want to be investing your money into a property in an area where there's a lot of crime, because high crime rates typically negatively impact the prices of properties over time. In saying that as well, some areas like that which do have higher crime rates can undergo a massive change, and they end up becoming quite nice from areas to actually live in. On the Gold Coast where I live, there is actually one of the areas which has a bit of a stigma about it, because not that it was a high crime rate area, but it used to be housing commission, and as a result there was a bit of kind of drug abuse and things like that in the area. But because of its proximity to the city and its closeness to like the waterfront areas and stuff like that, people started investing in the area and actually updating it. So they actually bought the old properties, knocked them down, built newer houses, duplexes, things like that. And the area is actually becoming a much nicer area to be living in. Not like some of the other areas surrounding it, but still a nicer area than what it had been in the past. So now you know how much you can borrow, and you're starting to get a feel for which areas you can kind of invest in according to your budget and things like that. You can actually start trying to narrow down your searches. And one thing which a lot of property investors suggest doing, and US property investor Manny Koshman suggests doing, is actually trying to find the best street or the worst house in the best street, or look for like the best streets and surrounding streets there. Typically what I found myself as well with property is, no matter which suburb you go to, there's always going to be like one or two streets which have higher property values, much nicer aspects, views and things like that, and typically attract a bit more money for them. So once you find the kind of those streets as well, you want to try and, like I said, find like the worst house in that street. So you also want to kind of look for street appeal of the house in those streets. So you want to look to see what the street appeal of that property is like. So you want to see if from the front of the street that the house has a nice design, is a nice open feel to it, or just appeals to you in general. Now, if it's an investment property or something you might be doing a renovation to, you always want to think about who you're going to be selling it to afterwards. So you want to think about your target market afterwards, not necessarily just for yourself, because no point in kind of buying something for yourself and doing something to a property for yourself, and then when you go to sell it afterwards, no one's going to buy it. So just something to consider there as well. So like I said, street frontage is also very important. Does matters a bit more compared to the back, because you don't typically see the back of the property unless you're on a waterfront property, in which case people can go past on boats, and you almost want to have a front and back street appeal kind of thing. From here, you want to look for properties which are typically undervalued for that area. So this means that you're going to be kind of comparing the property which you might be interested in to other properties in the area to see if it's undervalued, overvalued, also seeing if there is some kind of intrinsic value in that actual property, because this will actually help boost your wealth over time, because if you're buying undervalued, you already kind of got a bit of value on that property which is going to increase your wealth. So a property which I actually bought mid-September 2019, actually this property right here, I actually bought for just around $550,000 because what interested me in this property is that it wasn't just a house on a single lot, it was actually a house on a dual lot. So I was paying the market value for the house and property on something which was twice the size. So I actually got an extra 400 square meters of land, which I can actually kind of just demolish part of the house, subdivide, and actually have an entire empty block of land ready to use to build. So that was something which really appealed to me about this property here. So like I said, when looking at properties, you want to see what's the comparable value of properties in the surrounding areas and see if it's undervalued. You want to try and find something undervalued so that you've got already equity in the property and you're not starting on the back foot. Because if there's a market downturn as well, that value of the property kind of goes backwards, and if you're not in a position which you have that value, you're going to be going backwards over time instead of you got a bit of a buffer. And whenever I buy as well, I also look at what I can actually do to the property to increase its value. So not only do I want to try and buy something which is undervalued, I want to look at what I can actually do to that property to increase its value. So sometimes it might be a few cosmetic changes to the house interiorly, like the kitchen, bathrooms, bedrooms, or not necessarily bedrooms. They really don't change too much. It's pretty much 4 walls, wire cupboard. You might sometimes just want to change like the carpet to update it. But it also depends on what you actually want to do with the property. Is it going to be a renovation to flip, something you're going to live in, or is it something as a rental property? Because that also dictates to you what you can do or where you want to be spending your money. Sometimes if it's a rental property, you don't necessarily need to do too much to it. You can kind of get away with just updating some of the features around the house, like doing a fresh coat of paint, replacing carpets, updating some taps and things in the bathrooms and kitchen, and just making sure things work around the property. Whereas if you're going to do a renovation to flip, you sometimes do a bit more of a full renovation with like changing tiles, floorboards, carpets, repainting, kitchens, gardens, a fair bit around the property. And also as well, exteriorly you might want to kind of add a bit of an extension or something like that. So that's something you want to consider when buying a property, seeing what else you can actually do to it to kind of increase its value. So you can either, when you go to sell it, you can sell it for a much higher profit, or when you also rent it out, you might be getting a few more dollars per week on that rent. When doing a renovation, I typically allow for about $30,000 of my budget to actually renovate the property. That typically allows me to change a few things around the property and increase its value as well. As I said, fortunately for me, I've actually been in property for around 30 years and I've grown up in it. Father was a tiler when then we started building, renovating houses as well and moved into development. So as a result, I've got a wealth of knowledge in that area to actually understand what needs to be done. And that's something which comes with time as well. So just something to consider there for yourself, that you won't necessarily make a shit ton of money in the initial stages. It might take a few kind of property transactions to actually get some traction, see what goes right, what goes wrong. And the thing with property as well is because it's such a large investment, it does scare people off a little bit from doing anything. But if you do your homework right in the initial stages, you can actually end up quite well. So I typically use about $30,000 for my budget to actually renovate or modify the property slightly. And that's something which I've found is a reasonable amount to do a reasonable renovation on a reasonably sized home. Obviously, the larger the home and the more things you need to do, the more money you need to allow for that. So just something to consider there for yourself. As well as that, you also need to remember what you're actually going to use that property for. So as I was saying just earlier, if it's just going to be for a rental property, you don't necessarily need to do too much to that property, just update a few features and kind of tidy it up a little bit. Whereas a full renovation flip might need tens of thousands of dollars. So once you find the property that you're interested in and something you kind of like, it's time to start doing a few bits and pieces before you go to the agent for an offer. Here in Australia and in America, the systems are slightly different. I think from my understanding, you kind of go into escrow first and then do these next kind of steps. You want to kind of get a building and pest inspection on the property. You want to make sure that property that you're buying is actually sound and structurally stable, and that you don't have to end up spending tens of thousands of dollars on necessary repairs to the property to make sure it's a strong-standing property. A lot of people do make that mistake in that they see a house, they love how it looks and things like that, and then they don't necessarily understand what has come through on the pest and building inspection, and then they're up for tens of thousands of dollars of repairs on fixing structural walls and replacing roofing and stuff like that. As well as that pest and building inspection can actually be used as a negotiation tool when it comes to placing an offer on the property. Now, like I said, in Australia, we typically do it before we go place an offer. In America, I think you can do it once you're in escrow on the property. So once you've done all that, from there you can actually pretty much go to the agent if it's something that you actually like and actually start making an offer on the property. Now, depending on market conditions, you typically never would actually offer the asking value for the property. You always come in under, and that is the same thing again. You're trying to kind of put more money in your back pocket in as a bit of a buffer. So I typically go between $10,000 and $20,000 under asking price. Like I said, though, it depends on the market and the market cycle, because currently here in Australia, if you're watching this when I posted it, it's just kind of post-lockdown pandemic kind of thing, and everyone was expecting property prices to drop down a bit further from where they were standing, but unfortunately what ended up happening is people are moving from interstate, from southern states like New South Wales and Victoria to Queensland, where we have a much more outdoor lifestyle, better climate and things like that, and there was no kind of downturn in the actual property, and it actually pushed prices up. So as a result of that, people weren't able to negotiate on prices as easily. People who were trying to sell were actually getting what they were asking for or above it, and it created a bit of a bidding war. So another thing to remember when looking at property is kind of the market cycle. So when buying a property, you don't necessarily want to be buying at the top or at the peak of the cycle, because if there is a downturn, you're going to be losing value in that property, and it's going to kind of mean you're going to have to hold on to that property for a lot longer, and you won't be able to generate some wealth or increase your wealth from it as easily. Whereas if you're buying when it's at the bottom or at the trough of the market cycle, as it goes up, the property price increases, and you'll be increasing your wealth a lot faster and a lot easier. And then if it depending on your strategy with the property, if you're trying to hold it for a year or two or shorter or whatever, you can actually sell it at a profit. Same thing, depends on what you want to achieve from the property. Some people go for $10,000 return, 10% return, $50,000. All depends on those kind of factors. So something you have to kind of sit down as well with yourself and actually map out a strategy. So once you actually place an offer on the property, there's a bit of backwards and forth between yourself and the seller, trying to negotiate on the price until you finally find a price where both of you kind of meet and are happy with actually settling on. And then it goes through the full sales process of, here in Australia, you got a cooling off period, finance approval, and then settlement, depending on what terms you actually place in the contract. But that's all dependent on you. There are strategies involved with that as well. If you're in the initial stages of buying property and things, I typically say just keep it simple. Don't necessarily put in too many clauses. Just make sure you do your research on the property before you're actually buying it. Like I said, make sure it's structurally sound, in a decent area that does show some growth as well as having nice street appeal, good part of the suburb, and then you can actually add value to the property. So those are probably a couple take-home points from this. Most of the other things are just procedural and they're pretty straightforward. So same thing as always, guys. If you found value from this video, hit the subscribe button, drop me a like, leave me a comment if you've got any questions. I'm always happy to kind of answer them for you, and I'll catch you on the next one.